Take your seats, please. Let's get going. Okay. Now it is time to deliberate on the substantive agenda items. The first topic on our list is extraterritorial application of national legislation sanctions imposed against third parties. To start this discussion, I again invite the Secretary General to make his introductory statements on the subject.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to introduce the agenda item, extraterritorial application of national legislations, sanctions imposed against third parties, as discussed in the Secretariat report, Aalco/58/Dar es Salaam/2019/SD/S6. This topic, Mr. Chairman, was originally introduced at the 36th session of the Aalco in the Tehran in 1997. Since the topic has been relevant to the current international situation, once again, the delegation is from Islamic Republic of Iran and an early intimation from the host country, United Republic of Tanzania, wish to include this topic into the agenda of this session. Mr. President, extraterritorial measures or the application of domestic laws having extraterritorial effect violates the sovereign interests of a state. Imposition of unilateral sanctions impermissible under international law is impermissible under international law as it violates the international rule of law, the core principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and the general principles of international law. Mr. President, the concept of extraterritorial application of national legislation violates the principles of the United Nations Charter, namely, the principle of sovereign equality and territorial integrity, secondly, the principle of non-intervention, and thirdly, the duty to cooperate. Hence, consensus by the international community shows that the coercive measures are not in conformity with such principles, and also the principle of duty to cooperate should be regarded as a rule of law. Mr. President, the concept of extraterritorial application of national legislation also breaches human rights obligations. These include the right to self-determination, the right to development, the right to life and associated rights, right to food, right to health and medicine. Extraterritorial application of national legislations and violation of human rights obligations such as law enforcement may result in unilateral coercive measures that create obstacles to trade relations among states, impeding the full realization of the rights set forth in international human rights instruments. The United Nations General Assembly has repeatedly denounced economic coercion as a means to achieve political goals in its resolutions. It is noteworthy that economic sanctions that seek to achieve regime changes in the targeted states or infringe upon its political independence may not amount to violation of right to self-determination of the people, may amount to violation of right to self-determination of the people of that state and the right to choose their government. Moreover, the right to development has implicit references in several international human rights instruments and the United Nations Charter. It's also important to note that under any justification, the extraterritorial applications cannot occur at the cost of human life. The right to life and its associated rights are fundamental human rights which have been confirmed in several international human rights instruments. This in itself delays the development of their economic infrastructure and results in the privation of overall development. Mr. President, the diverse aspects of unilateral and secondary sanctions remarkably have been addressed by the United Nations. Since the Vienna Declaration and the program of action adopted by the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, the topic has been given more attention, and the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have adopted important instruments to this effect. Mr. President, in view of these concerns, the Secretariat's report has covered the issue dealing with the overview of Aalco's work on the extraterritorial application of national legislations, sanctions imposed against third parties. Aalco Secretariat's special study on unilateral and secondary sanctions and international law perspective, human rights and unilateral coercive measures, appointed of the first special rapporteur and the appointment of the first special rapporteur by the Human Rights Council and recent ruling of the International Court of Justice are among the latest development in international law relating to the question of sanctions. On this note, I request the distinguished delegates to present their views and look forward to an in-depth deliberations on this agenda item. Thank you very much.
General. Now I open the floor to comments from member states on the topic. Discussions on this topic is open to both member states and observers. First, I invite the delegation of Tanzania.
Mr. President, I'd like to start by thanking you for according us this opportunity also to make an intervention on this important topic. Much of the background and the legal issues dealing with the extraterritorial application of national legislation and sanctions against third parties have been alluded by speakers in the morning and also by the Secretary General of Aalco. So I would want now to go and discuss this topic by giving an example which is pertinent to Tanzania, the United Republic of Tanzania, but also to the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC. The widely accepted sanctions are those issued by Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and more precisely Article 41, which has been widely used. But also at the regional level, we have witnessed the use of sanctions by EU, European Union in 48 situations, and by the African Union in 11 cases. And at times, the regional blocs impose their own sanctions not connected with the UN. So sanctions issued under the UN Charter and the regional blocs are widely accepted. However, international law leaves room for unilateral measures by states which are subject to controversy regarding their lawfulness, in particular if they are imposed extraterritorially. It is about the sanctions applied by a country acting alone or almost alone. Unilateral sanctions are widely criticized as violating the principle of state sovereignty and the rule of law and holding the risk of breaking other principles of international law. Accordingly, unilateral sanctions could be considered as a challenge to the existing international legal order, which is anchored in the UN Charter, according to which sanctions are to be imposed by the UN Security Council following determination that there is a threat to or a breach of international peace and security. In other words, UN member states are not entitled to impose economic sanctions upon another member or any sovereign state. The case of the issue that I want to bring forward to this session is the issue of unilateral sanctions against Zimbabwe. Sanctions against Zimbabwe can be partly traced on the land reforms in Zimbabwe, which officially began in 1980 by signing of the Lancaster House Agreement. It was an effort to equitably distribute land between black subsistence farmers and white Zimbabweans of European ancestry who had economic and political superiority. We all know about the United Declaration of Independence, and we all know how the people of Zimbabwe had to go to guerrilla warfare in order to fight for the freedom of their country. So at independence, the United Kingdom, which was the colonial power in 1980, requested for a moratorium on the issue of land. Although the Zimbabwean authorities were empowered to initiate the necessary reforms, as long as land was bought and sold on a willing basis, and that the British government would finance half of the cost. However, in the late 1990s, the UK Prime Minister at that time, Tony Blair, terminated the agreement when funds from the Margaret Thatcher's administration were exhausted, repudiating all the commitments to land reforms in Zimbabwe. In responding to that, Zimbabwe embarked in forcibly confiscation of white farmers' land without compensation, and a fast-track redistribution campaign. In response to what was described as the fast-track land reforms in Zimbabwe, the US government put the Zimbabwean government on credit freeze in 2001 through the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001. The act imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, allegedly to provide for transition to democracy and economic recovery. It is sad to note that Zimbabwe has been on sanctions since 2001. The sanctions dates back to the reign of the former president, the late President Robert Gabriel Mugabe. The EU sanctions on Zimbabwe consist an arms embargo and the targeted assets freezes and travel bans, while the US has imposed financial restrictions under Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001. Sanctions under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and travel sanctions against individuals and entities under the executive orders. Further, on 2nd March 2018, the US extended its sanctions regime on Zimbabwe until 2019, and the EU has done the same on February 2018, and renewed its sanctions on Zimbabwe for another year. Today, such unilateral sanctions constitute an increasingly preferred choice for certain states and present a dilemma of growing significance. Today, sanctions are hugely criticized for the side effects they have on the civil population, but more importantly, their imposition may ultimately not be successful in achieving their stated political objectives. It is on this basis that we call for the removal of sanctions against Zimbabwe. We oppose this kind of unilateralism in interfering in the domestic affairs of other states. This also abrogates Article 2, Sub-Article 4 of the principle enshrined under the United Nations Charter, and it is against international law. With the Zimbabwe sanctions and many other around the world today, it is an open secret that today there is a growing movement of states arguing for the illegality of unilateral coercive measures. For instance, on its part, the United Nations has, according to Resolution 27/21, created the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on human rights, in which resolutions such unilateral coercive measures and legislations are declared to be contrary to international law, contrary to international humanitarian law, and contrary to the UN Charter and norms and principles governing peaceful relations among states, and highlights that these measures on long term may result into humanitarian concerns on targeted states. As indicated in the Secretariat brief on this topic, unilateral sanctions must be examined from the position of the relevant UN General Assembly adopted resolutions A/Res/58/200 of 2014, which condemned certain unilateral coercive measures as being tools for political or economic pressure against any country. 2. Resolution A/Res/73/167 of 17th December 2018, and 3. Resolution A/Res/73/167 of 17th December 2018. In addition, it is important to take note of the Human Rights Council Resolution A/HRC/39/54 of 2018, which declared that sanctions especially those purporting to have extraterritorial effect, are used as a routine foreign policy tool against each and every state, government, or entity that the most prolific sanctions user unilaterally determines on the basis of questionable evidence or mere suspicion or allegations of a corrupt regime engaged in malign activities in attempting to subvert Western democracies. The very architecture of the international system based on the Charter of the United Nations and the International Bill of Human Rights is at risk. In August 2019, the Southern African Development Community expressed a firm solidarity with Zimbabwe, calling for an end to the crippling sanctions. As part of the United Republic of Tanzania chairmanship of SADC, we have championed a campaign to call upon the international community to lift sanctions against Zimbabwe, be it unilateral or multilateral. The SADC communique states that summit noted the adverse impact on the economy of Zimbabwe and the region at large of prolonged economic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe, and expressed solidarity with Zimbabwe and called for the immediate lifting of the sanctions to facilitate socio-economic recovery in the country. As according to the communique, SADC summit further declared 25th November as the date on which SADC member states can collectively voice their disapproval of the sanctions through various activities and platforms until the sanctions are lifted. You may wish to note that on 27 September 2019, while addressing the UN Nations General Assembly, I appealed to the international community and called for lifting up of unilateral sanctions against Zimbabwe. For far long, a painful experience by any standard. In that speech, I said, and I quote, "The government of the United Republic of Tanzania, as chair of SADC, would like to urge the international community to call for lifting up of unilateral sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. Far too long, Zimbabwe has been on sanctions which have negatively affected its people, especially the vulnerable groups such as women, elderly, and children. These sanctions have also negatively affected the other countries in the Southern African region. These unilateral sanctions should unconditionally be removed." It is heartwarming and noteworthy that Zimbabwe's President Emerson Mnangagwa used the platform of the United Nations General Assembly to deliver a clarion call for the removal of unilateral and illegal sanctions against his country on 25th September 2019. The Special Rapporteur on Negative Impact of Coercive Measures on Human Rights, on his report, expressed concerns that sanctions that were applied to certain politicians in Zimbabwe during the national elections in July 2018 were unnecessary coercive measures that negatively affected the rights of Zimbabweans to choose their own political future. While the Special Rapporteur welcomed the regime change in Zimbabwe and stressed that the regime change could not happen under a shadow of economic coercion, he noted that the sanctions has led only to the suffering of ordinary people rather than bringing political change, which was desired. The adverse effects of financial sanctions on the economy of the target state, and at times the region, is often quite perceptible, as in the case of Zimbabwe. In this regard, therefore, the United Republic of Tanzania, through this platform, urges other member states of Aalco to have a common voice and be heard against the abuse of extraterritorial application of domestic laws contrary to the established norms of international law. Specifically, the United Republic of Tanzania urges Aalco member states to call upon all states that have imposed sanctions against Zimbabwe to lift them. Zimbabwe, as a sovereign state, has the right to self-determination and has the right to exercise its power and freedom as a sovereign state. I am particularly glad that Aalco is also taking the lead in this regard and salute the efforts. Perhaps it not be too late to place a recommendation at this stage that going forward, Aalco undertakes a special study on the illegality of sanctions against human rights consideration. For example, with case studies of the most affected countries I have made reference to. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Tanzania, Professor Kabudi. Now I have to give the floor to the next speaker, which is Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. At the outset, I would like to thank Aalco for re-inclusion of this important and necessary topic in its agenda, especially in the light of the recent developments emanating from adventurism. I also express my gratitude to the Secretariat for preparation of the report on this topic and its evaluation regarding different aspects of the topic. Mr. President, the founders of the United Nations has perceived to establish a new era in which the rule of law and justice could be the foundation of new international order, thus creating a sound platform for human beings to realize their aspirations. Despite all these commitments and regardless of existence of a robust legal framework established on the basis of states' obligation under international law, unilateralism is the most pressing challenge for the rule of law at the international level. It has been crystallized either in the form of waging trade war against countries, imposition of extraterritorial illegal economic and trade sanctions, or any other international wrongful act which have paralyzed the foundations of international law and rule-based international legal order. This could lead in some cases to the economic terrorism which indiscriminately targets civilians and causes them pain and suffering at the interest of political purposes. Today, it has been clear for everybody that in practice, sanctions, even those of the United Nations Security Council, have not succeeded in realizing their defined objectives. Instead, it has been targeting the most vulnerable people and innocent civilians with no other effect and result but infringement of fundamental human rights, including in particular the right to life. This is why we can now claim that the unilateral sanctions are in contradiction with principles of international law enshrined in the UN Charter and those stated in 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, including principle of sovereign equality of states, non-intervention, and duty to cooperation, as was highlighted by the Secretary General. Moreover, the negative effects of extraterritorial application also affect international cooperation in different areas. To cite an example, unilateral sanctions detrimental to collective response to crimes impacts negatively on allocation of resources and impairs cooperation in combating crimes such as transnational organized crimes, corruption, human trafficking, and smuggling of migrants. The UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights has clearly made the point that certain sets of preemptory norms, Yuskogans, could possibly be breached through the imposition of at least certain forms of economic sanctions. This is why he refers to the Article 41, Para 2 of the ILC articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts and concludes that states could be under a legal obligation not to recognize and or aid to the unilateral sanctions, especially those applied extraterritorially and secondary economic sanctions. Such an obligation derives from the well-established general principle of law, ex injuria jus non oritur, meaning that legal rights cannot derive from illegal acts. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran, in an effort to respect the international rule of law, has chosen to recourse to the International Court of Justice. Last year, The ICJ, in its provisional order, reiterated that the United States is obliged under its international commitments to remove the obstacles created as a result of its actions and illegal decisions made upon its pullout from the nuclear deal JCPOA, including the impediments which have emerged on the path of Iran's trade in certain domains. The court has also recognized the damages and irreparable harm that the U.S. has caused to Iran and its international business relations. The court unanimous order was another clear testament to the illegality of the United States sanctions against our people and citizens. However, since the indication of the order, the U.S. has failed to implement measures instructed by the court, but on the contrary, by imposing new sanctions, it has moved on an opposite direction, though we have passed the waves of this unprecedented pressure. In another move, the U.S. has illegally and in flagrant violation of international law confiscated billions of dollars of assets of the people, government, and Central Bank of Iran, in clear breach of its immunity. In this regard, the Islamic Republic of Iran had instituted proceedings against the United States before the International Court of Justice. The court unanimously has found that it has jurisdiction, and this case is now in the merit stage. Mr. President, in conclusion, we maintain the time is ripe to take urgent actions against these kinds of unilateralism which endanger solidarity and coexistence in the international community and runs counter to the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter. In this context, we invite Aalco Secretariat, in furtherance of the previous studies it has undertaken, and we appreciate their efforts, to prepare a special study on the illegality of the extraterritorial application of national laws, and in particular its impact on third countries. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, nowadays we are facing a wider array of global challenges and resurgent unilateralism and power politics, especially characterized by unilateral sanctions against other countries beyond the framework of UN Security Council. China remains consistent in its position to oppose unilateral sanctions as such because of its threat to international peace, stability, and development. Firstly, such unilateral sanctions in many occasions violate the integrity of UN Security Council sanctions and cannot be deemed legal. The Security Council resolutions for sanctions are normally adopted as a package after considering various factors in a comprehensive and balanced manner, including their purposes, means, scope, and humanitarian effects. Above all, sanctions resolutions demonstrate the vital role played by UN collective security mechanism. According to the UN Charter, Security Council resolutions are legal abiding to its all member states. All member states shall implement the resolutions. Unilateral sanctions, which go beyond the scope of the Security Council resolutions for sanctions, are in breach of the delegate consensus and balance. It goes against the UN Charter and finds no basis in international law. Secondly, unilateral sanctions are often accompanied by improper long-arm jurisdiction, which violates the basic norms of exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction. Unilateral sanctions are often adopted by a state in accordance with its domestic law to meet its political needs. Sometimes, secondary sanctions are imposed upon the third states by establishing and exercising jurisdiction based on extremely thin connections, resulting in the improper extraterritorial application of its domestic laws. Such sanctions violate the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and basic principles of international law, especially the principles of sovereign equality and non-interference, and put the stability of international relations at risk. Mr. President, China is of the view that the abuse of unilateral sanctions are not only in lack of legitimacy and justification in international law, but also won't help to solve the problem. On the contrary, it will bring tension to international relations. China always advocates that when it comes to state-to-state relations, the principle of mutual respect, equal treatment, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation should be followed. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate from the People's Republic of China. Are there any other interventions? Yes. I recognize the distinguished representative from Egypt.
شكرا جزيلا سعادة الرئيس. فيما يتعلق بموقف جمهورية مصر العربية من تطبيق التشريعات الوطنية خارج الحدود، العقوبات المفروضة على الأطراف الثالثة، فأود أن أؤكد على ما يلي. تعرب جمهورية مصر العربية عن موقفها المبدئي بشأن معارضة استخدام التشريعات الوطنية كأداة لفرض عقوبات أحادية الجانب على الدول الأخرى، ولا سيما فرض العقوبات على الأطراف الثالثة، نظرا لمخالفة ذلك النهج لمبدأ المساواة في السيادة بين الدول الذي يشكل عماد القانون الدولي، كما يعد أيضا تجاوزا لحدود الولاية الإقليمية للتشريعات الوطنية، فضلا عما يمثله هذا النهج من انتهاك لمبدأ عدم التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية. تشدد مصر كذلك على خطورة استخدام التشريعات الوطنية كأداة لفرض العقوبات على الأطراف الثالثة على الصعيد الدولي، لما تمثله من تهديد صريح لركائز التنظيم الدولي المعاصر، على نحو قد يدفع الدول المعنية إلى تبادل اتخاذ التدابير الانتقامية ويفضي إلى تهديد السلم والأمن الدوليين. اتصالا بما تقدم، فإن مصر تؤمن بأن الإطار المشروع والمقبول لفرض عقوبات على إحدى الدول إنما يكون عبر الأطر الدولية الجماعية، ولا سيما بواسطة مجلس الأمن، وذلك بمقتضى ما لدى المجلس من سلطات وصلاحيات في هذا الشأن بمقتضى ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، باعتباره الجهاز الرئيسي المعني بحفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين. وشكرا سيادة الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Egypt. I now call upon the distinguished delegate from Palestine.
يعني هذه القضية تعتبر مهمة جدا، وهي تطبيق التشريعات الوطنية خارج الحدود. موقف دولة فلسطين مع كافة الكلمات، وهو موقف القانون الدولي، لأنه فرض العقوبات الأحادية يعتبر مخالفا وانتهاكا للمادة 41 من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، وبالتالي فرض العقوبات عن طريق مجلس الأمن مباح، ولكن من هذه الدولة أو تلك هذا محرم ويعتبر انتهاكا صارخا لمبادئ وقواعد القانون الدولي فيها وحقوق الإنسان. كافة الاتفاقيات الدولية كذلك تحرم وتجرم. أنا أود أن أضيف قضية في غاية الأهمية، ليس فرض التشريعات في ظل السلم، وإنما كذلك في ظل الاحتلال، وهذا ما يحصل في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة من قبل السلطة القائمة بالاحتلال إسرائيل، تقوم بفرض عقوبات جماعية على الشعب الفلسطيني، وذلك بحرمانه من حق تقرير المصير وإقامة جدار الفصل العنصري الذي قسم الشعب الفلسطيني داخل حدود الخط الأخضر، وكذلك الترحيل القسري. ما يجري في وادي الحمص وفي مدينة القدس الشرقية هو ترحيل قسري جماعي ضد السكان المدنيين. الاستيطان كذلك يعتبر عقوبات جماعية. وفي الفترة الأخيرة قامت إسرائيل بسن تشريعات عنصرية من قبل الكنيست بإصدار قوانين كقانون القومية وقانون النكبة وغيره من القوانين التي تخالف المواثيق والمعاهدات الدولية بحق الأطفال والنساء في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. في الفترة الأخيرة قامت إسرائيل تحت بند الثأر، ما يسمى في القانون الدولي الإنساني الثأر أو الاختصاص بحق السكان المدنيين، بحجة أن الأسرى كما تدعي إرهابيين داخل السجون الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وقامت بقرصنة أموال السلطة الوطنية الفلسطينية. وحاليا يعاني الشعب الفلسطيني من ما يسمى بالتجويع ضد السكان المدنيين، وهذه جريمة يعاقب عليها القانون الدولي الإنساني. أنا أقترح أن يضاف بما أنها تعتبر جريمة يعاقب عليها القانون، لا يحق للدولة أو لشخص من أشخاص القانون الدولي فرض عقوبات أولا يأتي أو يندرج تحت إطار تهميش الدور الرئيسي لمجلس الأمن ويهدد الأمن والسلم في العالم. لا بد من النص على تجريم هذه الجريمة تحت أي بند من الجرائم
which are committed in this part, whether imposing sanctions or
النظام الأساسي للمحكمة الجنائية الدولية أو من خلال
should be considered a violation of international
لدى محكمة العدل الدولية حول هذا الوضع، من أجل وضع حد. وعلى الدول في منظمة ألكو أن لا تعترف بالواقع من قبل فرض عقوبات، أن تتعاون بهذه القرارات من قبل هذه الدولة أو تلك في هذا الجانب. وشكرا.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Palestine, who is also the Vice President of Aalco. I now call upon the distinguished delegate from Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. On the issue of extraterritorial application of national legislation, sanctions imposed against third parties, my delegation is of the view that unilateral sanctions are against the fundamental principle of national sovereignty and international law. Especially in the present discussion, it involves third parties. Indonesia would like to comment on the current situation in Iran that brought upon these topics. Indonesia views the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action agreed by US, UK, France, China, Russia, and Germany in 2015 as a historic achievement within the framework of multilateral diplomacy and negotiations to address the issue of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. We regret the US decision to withdraw from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and unilaterally reinstates economic sanctions against Iran. We call all parties to uphold the UN Security Council's decision in support of Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action endorsed by Resolution 2231 in 2015 in order to maintain world peace and security. My delegation emphasizes the importance of making Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as a building blocks, the basis for strengthening trust and confidence between Iran and all related parties, including the US. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, distinguished delegate from Indonesia. Are there any more member states who would like to make interventions? Or even non-member states that would like to make intervention on this topic? I see none. I now invite, therefore, the Secretariat to give the next course of action and any procedural issues that would be associated with that.
Thank you, Mr. President. According to our schedule, Mr. President, this agenda item was allocated this time before coffee break and even after coffee break. In view of the fact that we have been able to exhaust this important topic timely, the matter has to be decided so that the subsequent topics that are currently scheduled for tomorrow should now be discussed. In view of that, I'm aware that the next substantive topic for discussion is the selected item on the agenda of the International Law Commission. However, the delegates representing the International Law Commissions are not in the audience at the moment. At the same time, the following topic on international law in the cyberspace, also experts to this topic are not in the audience. In view of that, Mr. President, it is the Secretariat's recommendation to take up either one of the following matters shortly after break, namely law of the sea and or peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, the decision whether we take the law of the sea now or the peaceful settlement of dispute can be discussed informally during the short break. Accordingly, we would recommend that we break for refreshment for 15 minutes, and then we shall resume. Upon then, the decision will be made whether the law of the sea or peaceful settlement of dispute will be discussed. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Secretary General. Let us now take a break for about 15 minutes and return to the hall at 4 o'clock. Thank you to all the speakers and the interventions that were made in the session on this topic.